It's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with our very own Florence Villeminot. Hi, Flo.
Hey, Jeannie.
Today we're going to focus on a little something different, France's love of comic books.
And let's dive right in with our word du jour and our acronym du jour, which is a bande dessinée, more commonly known as BD. So literally drawn strips, but it's much more than drawn strips. It's really a whole thing. In fact, it's called the ninth art here in France. French language BDs tend to be a little bit different than US style comics or Japanese mangas. The format and the style of the drawings are very different, but it's quite hard to generalize BDs because there are so many different types of BDs. But one thing is sure, and that is that French people love their bande dessinée, and it's not just for kids or geeks. It's really a nationwide phenomenon. 1 in 4 books sold in France is a graphic novel. 68 million BDs were sold in 2024. That's about 1 BD per inhabitant.
It's truly a phenomenon here in France. But what's interesting is that many of the classic BDs that are favorites here are actually from Belgium.
That's right. France taking credit for something that's Belgian. That's something that happens quite a lot. Think French fries. Now, Belgium, and in particular Francophone Belgium, Wallonia, has really been a BD mecca since the 1940s. For instance, perhaps one of the most famous French language comic strips is The Adventures of Tintin. We just saw it there by the Belgian cartoonist Hergé. We're getting a sneak peek of some other French favorites that are actually Belgian. So you saw Lucky Luke, Blake and Mortimer, Gaston Lagaffe, and the Smurfs, Les Schtroumpfs in France. But here you can see it. France also has some of its own classics, chief among them The Adventures of Asterix, which follows the adventures of a village of Gauls as they resist the Roman occupation in 50 BC. It's a very important part of French pop culture. There's actually even a theme park, Parc Astérix, which rivals the Disneyland Paris.
Yeah, and comic books are such an important part of culture here in France that there are actually several comic book festivals around the country. The most important one of them is in Angoulême, the International Comics Festival.
It's a 4-day festival that's taken place every January since 1974. It's kind of like the Cannes Film Festival of the comic book world. All the who's who of the BD world really gather there in Angoulême, which is a city in southwestern France, the BD Mecca of France, you could say. It's a favorite for comic book artists and for fans as well, who get to meet their heroes.
Ça fait une dizaine d'années que je viens. Ici, on rencontre vraiment des auteurs d'autres pays, des Américains, des Espagnols qu'on ne trouve pas facilement en librairie, quoi.
Parfois, on est surpris par rapport à nos albums, quelles sont les images qui sont restées en tête. Et c'est intéressant de, comme ça, confronter les points de vue.
So we just saw a female comic book author there, but for a very long time, the world of comics was really dominated by men, and female characters are often criticized for being hypersexualized in these BDs. But these days, there are more and more women in the industry, but they're still largely underrepresented.
They certainly are. Women only represent about 20% of comic book creators, and they often struggle in the male-dominated industry. For instance, they're often paid less and they receive fewer awards. For instance, at the Angoulême Festival, there was a huge scandal about the fact that not enough women were receiving prizes or even nominated for them in the first place. That things are changing a little bit. Things are bound to change a little bit, hopefully, though, because girls represent about 80% of students in French art schools, and there is a real thirst for material by women.
Le paysage de la bande dessinée, il a changé, ça c'est sûr. Il s'est énormément féminisé. Je pense que comme dans tous les domaines de la création, les femmes et généralement les gens qui n'ont pas eu beaucoup la parole avant apportent de toute façon un renouveau, des histoires qu'on n'a pas entendues, racontées par des gens qu'on n'a pas entendus. Forcément que ça vient remettre du sang neuf et une fraîcheur et une modernité. L'arrivée des autrices a amené des lectrices. Et ça, c'est quand même déjà... la bande dessinée peut leur dire merci pour ça, je pense.
And while we're talking about this kind of illustration, I think it's really important to talk about satirical cartoons, which are also a very popular form of expression here in France.
And we've talked a lot about it, particularly in the wake of the 2015 attacks on Charlie Hebdo. So political and social satire are really an important French tradition that date back to the revolution, even before then, when the satire was used to mock the clergy and the monarchy. You can see some examples here. So in graphic form, it's really been an institution in the French press. So we talked a lot about the irreverence of Charlie Hebdo, but there's also the weekly newspaper Le Canard Enchaîné, which always publishes scandals about corruption in politics, etc. Fluide Glacial, there are all sorts of these political satire magazines or newspapers, and there's a real attachment in France to a fundamental freedom of being able to make fun of everyone and everything.
C'est une manière à la fois de dire les choses, de ne pas se prendre au sérieux, de se moquer, d'être énervant. La caricature, on est là pour être énervant, c'est du poil à gratter, mais on fait du bien là où ça fait mal.
So some cartoons and BDs are seen as an enjoyable form of entertainment, and others are seen as a much-needed counterpower and an important medium for getting people to think, which must be, we can arguably say, is something very French.
It certainly is. Flo, thank you so much for that and for that closer look at comic book culture, which is such a big deal here in France. Don't forget, if you have your own questions about France or the French, you can always ask Flo at Flo Villeneuve.